I want to ask you a question about a controversy that's going on in Israel. I'm not so. What's going on with the controversy? We don't need to discuss, but I just your understanding of and your view, which I'm sure is reflective of things that the Rebbe has said about this. I just saw a video about I forgot his name. His last name is Roth, who's a Hasidic Jew, who he looks like he's maybe in his 30s, if I had to guess, who decided to join the army. And he said, how can I not join the army when I'm seeing all of my brothers and the sacrifices they're making? And the fascination with that interview, it was a 5-minute interview on some station in Israel, is that he's coming from a community where they generally do not go to the army. Hardly anyone from his community does go to the army. And this touches on the big controversy in Israel about the religious going to the army. And I'm just going to actually share some of my thoughts and feelings, and then get your view on it. So some of my thoughts and feelings, because it's a mixture of both, is on one hand, we understand. When I say we, I'm going to say you and I understand. I think we're in agreement. I'll say that there are two parts to every person. That's the body and the soul. Spirit is even more important than body in many respects. We know that it's not the size of the man in the fight; it's the size of the fight in the man. Spirit is very, very important. And that's the reason. That is the at least my understanding is that the basis for the absolute need, as there has always been by the Jewish people, for us to have both the army fighting a physical war and an army fighting a spiritual war. So we do need to have the IDF, and no one questions that. But I will say, no one questions that because we're very entrenched in the physical world. But we're not naturally as entrenched in, but we need equally is a spiritual army as well. And that's really what the yeshivas that we know, that's where we need people who are studying Torah and living, spending their time studying Torah, which emboldens and strengthens the spirit of the Jewish people. So both of those are critically important. And historically, the Jewish people have had an army forever. King David was a prophet, man of God, one of the greatest Torah scholars of his generation, and a general. Fascinating. I think we can't forget that, right? And we need both of those sides, and he had the capacity for both of those. It's hard to carry all of that together, but we need both. At the same time, sometimes it's possible that we'll use the yeshiva cover or the religious cover, even though I'm not a very studious person and I'm not spending much time studying. And, I feel that when it's being used as a cover, that's a problem, because I really empathize with families who have made the ultimate sacrifice of their sons being killed, and I understand the emotion of their feeling that they're carrying the burden while the others aren't. Now, part of that emotion I feel is not accurate simply because they don't have a spiritual viewpoint to understand the other side. But at the same time, I feel that we need to have the integrity to bring the extent that we can and should to the army. So if there are circumstances and situations where we have able-bodied people who would appropriately belong in the army, that they should be going and serving. And I know what I'm speaking about is very controversial.
It doesn't sound controversial at all.
Okay, great. I would love to hear, your feedback on what I just said.
Sure. Okay. So I think it's I guess very funny to me, or like ironic, because I've been blessed to live in Israel for quite a few years, in Judea and Samaria, primarily Judea. But I feel like the perspective that you have on issues when you're on the ground is so radically different than when you see the clickbaity media. And of course, you spend time in Israel. So I'm not saying you're that guy.
Yeah.
I'm saying more that the perspective which I am here on this topic is usually so incredibly uninformed, and it's very almost clickbaity. And also, I think when it comes to politics, that very often people in politics use issues in order to create artificial divisions in society, or to scapegoat certain people to whip up fear in order to accrue political power. And I think that this whole issue of what's called Giyus Charedim, of drafting the Haredi people, drafting the ultra-Orthodox into the Israeli army, is very much something which is deeply, deeply misunderstood, like the nuances and the complexity of the issue. So I'd like to maybe unpack a little bit of the complexity, also to expand on why I agree with basically what you said, but maybe to offer like a little bit more. A little more color.
I'll just say I already love where you're going with this.
Okay, thanks.
And interestingly, there are many indications, and have been publicized of the religious or Hesder yeshiva. I don't know if they're battalions or whatever they would be called, who have proven to, first of all, have had tragically tremendous losses, also have been proven to be very fierce. And sometimes the fiercest of the fighters.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Anyway, but
absolutely.
You'll elaborate.
Totally. Yeah, which I'll actually just make a plug for anybody watching at home. A Hesder unit, which is currently serving in Syria, reached out to me asking if they could get a little bit of money for their gear. So anyone wants to donate, you can click the link in the description. Be that as it may.
You'll send it to me.
Yes. Yes. So be that as it may. So let's unpack this issue. Maybe just one more point of preface. In the course of writing this book, I attempted to speak to as many leading military thinkers in the United States as I could. I won't mention their names in this podcast simply because they might appreciate that if one day we'll get permission. But the point is, you'll see if you do read the book that a lot of military thinkers, both from centuries ago and from today, are quoted. Now, yes, I had, thank God, very productive conversation with these people. They offer their insight. But one thing they spoke about again and again was what's up with those Haredim, those ultra-Orthodox not going to the army, right? So it's something that's really hit the media everywhere, right? Okay, so maybe to answer the question with a few vignettes, and then to offer an abstract sense, and then like what the prognosis looks like for the future. And two personal stories. So in my travels with roving rabbis, once upon a time, I had the merit of being the rabbi of a pop-up community in Pokhara, Nepal. And the Pokhara, Nepal does not have a year-long Jewish community, but after the Israeli army, right, since being in the army for 3 years is a very intense experience, a very demanding experience, often a traumatizing experience. Many Israelis go for what's called the Tiyul B'Mizrach, which means the trek in the Far East. And one of the stations they'll go is the foothills of the Himalayas. They're in Pokhara. So I remember I was getting off a bus to Pokhara at 3:00 in the morning on Friday morning, and I get off the bus with my suitcase and my rabbinic partner. And we meet providentially two former Israeli soldiers who were currently on their Tiyul B'Mizrach, on their trek in the Far East. And one of them had been an operator in Shaldag, which is Israel's Navy SEALs. And he marvels at these two young Chabad rabbis setting up shop to start setting up the Shabbat meal for what will happen, in what's it called? A few hours later on Friday, right? And he says, you know what? Shlichut zekemot tzava lechabadnikim, which means that being an emissary going out and spreading Judaism is sort of like the army for these Chabad people, meaning to say that there are a lot of different ways to serve the Jewish people. One of them, might entail being at a machine gun position in front of a very tense town, right? And another is to provide that spiritual support to young Israelis. And one challenge that Israel has is in the absence of connection to the Jewish tradition. Many young Israelis ask, why should I stay in this country? Why should I have to deal with missiles coming in? It's just too much. Let me go to Bulgaria. Let me go to Italy, and I'll live a good life, right? And very often the fact that there are Chabad rabbis in all these different places, and as a Chabad rabbi here, I'm sure you have this experience all the time. You'll have Israelis who are, like Jonah in the Bible, running away from God's prophecy, and by reconnecting to purveyors of Torah and purveyors of mitzvot, of God's commandments, the Jewish practice, these people are better able to connect or to reconnect to the tradition. So that's one vignette. Now, another vignette is I myself never served in the Israeli army. There was a time that I very seriously considered it, and actually one of my study partners in yeshiva, who we spent countless hours studying Talmud and Jewish mysticism together. Thank God today he lives in Samaria. He has 6 kids, and he's been in full-scale war in Gaza in the special forces twice. He's what's called a Hasidic Jew, a Chabad Chassid, wears a long black coat, teaches Torah when he's not at his computer programming job, and he's very very much the real deal. So yeah, there was a time I considered following my good friend's path, but I myself have never served in the Israeli army, but have done a lot of work as a rabbi supporting various IDF bases. So actually, this past Passover, I was the rabbi of an IDF base. In a very tense place, thank God, I came back whole in body and spirit. I can tell you that some of the other young rabbis there with me were terrified the entire time, but we all came back alive. Be that as it may, so I'm leading the Seder. Now, after the Seder, there's a young man who comes up to me, and he has a full black beard, and he's wearing a black yarmulke. And like in typical yeshiva bacher style, yeshiva student style, comes with a pile of books. He starts asking me various questions about Passover. Anyways, I'm curious. I'm like, hey, tell me, what's your story? So he says, I was learning in a very prominent Haredi yeshiva whose name I won't name. At a certain point, he's like, the studying all day was getting like a little bit intense for me. I found myself in the coffee room a little bit too much, smoking a little bit too much, and felt like I was passing the time and I wanted to do something meaningful. So I asked the head of the yeshiva, maybe I could, work half of the day and I'll be in yeshiva half of the day. And I was like, no, we do only full-time learning. It's, it's one or the other. Okay, so he went to work full-time. Then, so he's of Sephardic heritage. So there was a soldier who he heard about in the media who was killed in action, and he's like, I want to replace that guy. I want to go to the army, and fine. So he goes to the army, and he's very excited to get into the special forces and replace this legendary soldier. Now, since the Israeli special forces are incredibly rigorous, he did not make it into the special forces. And he was dropped into a unit which is much less prestigious. And this was, they're doing very important things, but they maybe get headlined less. So, and I was the rabbi of this base. He comes over to me afterwards, and he says, in the midst of this conversation, he says, I have to tell you, it's really just so hard for me to be here. Like on this base, 80% of the soldiers are secular women. As somebody who was in a yeshiva my whole life, it's just a real challenge. Yeah. It's very mentally challenging, psychologically challenging, culturally challenging. And he's like, I'm doing what I have to do. I'm getting through it. I'm going to try to transfer to a unit that's more appropriate for me, but it's just really hard. Yeah. So I think sometimes we have to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of actors in the Israeli army who use the Israeli army as something of a cultural melting pot to strip people of their religious identity. Yeah. And I met commanders like this, and there really is such an agenda by certain people in certain echelons of the Israeli army, and it's something we need to be aware of. Yeah. On the other hand, you mentioned Hesder. So close by to where he was serving, there was a Hesder unit, and Hesder is a program. I actually did study at Hesder Yeshiva, so maybe I'm biased, but Hesder is a program where you study in yeshiva for 2 years, then you go to the army for 16 months, and then you go back to yeshiva for a year and a half, and then you're in reserves. And when you're in reserves, you can be called into battle anytime. I mentioned actually a few over the course of the conversation, many of the anecdotes about soldiers were guys who are in Hesder. But be that as it may, I spent a lot of time with these Hesder soldiers, and you go to their base and you see they're studying Torah, they're involved, and they're very much more keyed in and passionate and make better soldiers. Yeah. As you yourself said. And I think we're seeing, so I think I would say on an abstract level, there's 2 points. right? One is that there is, in fact, a lot of people in the Israeli government and in the Israeli army who are very insincere in their desire to bring Haredim into the army. If they really wanted to bring Haredim into the army, they'd be able to create tracks which would be much more fitting culturally for Haredim, and there is something of a move in that direction. That said, there are still members of the Israeli government and members of the military who don't like this Jewish thing. When they see the Jew with the beard, it like reminds them of their grandfather that they don't want to be like. They want to create the new Jew, the Western Jew, who will be respected when he walks down the streets of Paris. So that's a serious issue. I will say though that since October 7th, in the Haredi world in general, there's been a very strong move in the direction of a lot more people enlisting, certainly in Chabad. Meaning I can say, like, amongst my friends in Israel, in Chabad, at this point, probably 60% of them have served in the Israeli army, and many signed up after October 7th, to learn how to use that assault rifle and to learn how to defend their communities, and they're called. Like when things happen, like there was recently a terrorist attack in my neighborhood, and one of the Chabad gentlemen who had done this course of training, he was called. He was on the field, putting his life at risk. So I think we're seeing, as things have gotten more serious in Israel, we're seeing a tremendous inflection point in terms of Haredi participation in the army. And if people really want Haredi to participate in the army, the right way to go about it is not to create a siege mentality. The right way to go about it is not, we're going to force you to go to the army, otherwise you're going to go to jail, right? But rather to promote the idea of being a contributing member of society. That's one. But two is also to not look at the army as a way to impose a certain cultural way of being, but rather to make the army something that is amiable, that is consistent with being an Orthodox Jew. You shouldn't have to choose between being a halachically observant Jew and defending your country.
Beautiful, beautiful.